Hello, everybody. Hello, hello. Welcome to Atlantic Convention headquarters and our first cocktail caucus here in Philadelphia. We hope you've enjoyed the food and the drink, fuel for conversation, and that you're ready for the substance of the afternoon. We're calling this session Striking a Balance, and we're going to talk about two issues that are vital to the future of this country, energy and the environment. And today, the United States is the world's largest producer of oil and natural gas. We generate about 13% of our electricity from renewable sources. These developments have brought the country closer to energy independence, but also raise an important question. How does this country consolidate these gains while protecting the environment? We have a great lineup to help us address these questions. Before we begin, I want to thank the American Petroleum Institute's Vote for Energy project for making this conversation today possible. So please welcome Louis Finkel. He's API's Executive Vice President, Government Affairs, to say a few words. Louis.
Much thanks, Margaret, and thank you all for joining us today. I think this is a great way to start the week here in Philadelphia and start a really robust dialogue. I don't think there's anybody in the country that's better at trying to kind of really harness a 360-degree conversation about energy policy than Steve Clemons. So I think y'all are really fortunate today, and Steve and the Atlantic team have put together a really kind of well-balanced panel for all of you, which I think will give you a lot of differing perspectives on the energy equation. For API and for our Vote for Energy program, it's really about educating voters and making sure voters understand what the realities are. That the federal government, and it's not just any federal government, but this federal government with a Democratic president, says that we're going to need fossil fuels increasingly through 2040. And that we are currently at 20-year lows in carbon emissions, and the gross majority of those carbon emission drops is a result of an increased use of clean-burning natural gas. So I look forward to the dialogue today. I'm going to turn it back to Margaret, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Louis, so much. And a few notes before we get started. We are on Twitter at the hashtag TheAtlanticDNC. We know this is a conversation for rich conversation and debate, and so we'll have time for your questions. We'd really like people to be part of the conversation. So let's get rolling. Please welcome California Congressman Jerry McNerney. Before he got to Washington, he was a wind energy engineer and energy consultant for various utility companies. He now serves on the Committee on Energy and Commerce. Welcome. Congressman Henry Cuellar is from Laredo, Texas. He spent 11 years in the House representing a major energy producing state. Welcome, Congressman. Dan Esty is an environmental law professor at Yale, was formerly the commissioner of Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. They're all joined by my colleague, Washington editor-at-large, Steve Clemons. Steve.
Greetings, everybody.
All right, Steve.
We're all going to need a good stiff drink after this, I feel like. Thank you guys so much for showing up. I should mention, not to that it would matter very much, that Dan, what were you calling him, the most popular spouse, that his wife happens to be Elizabeth Esty, who's a member of Congress, and she's in the Bill Clinton confab that's meeting across, so we're sorry that we couldn't have her, but so glad to have Dan. Let me ask, I was just down in Cleveland, as many of you may have read, doing an interview with a couple of other members, Representative Bill Johnson and Representative Kevin Cramer. And I asked Kevin Cramer not only on his views on climate change, but what he thought were the most meritorious, the best bits of merit in environmentalists that had problems with where he was. And his response was that it didn't matter that they disagreed on climate change. He knew they believed in it, so he had to meet them sort of part way. And I'm really interested, Henry, you're a member of the Shale Caucus, and Jerry, you have written a book, if I may tell everyone to go buy it on Amazon. It is called Clean Energy Nation, Freeing America from the Tyranny of Fossil Fuels. So if the two of you were at a bar together, note bar over there, and the two of you to say where the middle ground is between how a legislator from Texas and how a legislator from California look at the balance, where would you guys begin? And let me just start with you, Jerry.
Well, we're going to need fossil fuels for a long time, but what we need to do is reduce fossil fuels and carbon emissions in a rational way that actually helps the economy to grow. And I think that's quite possible We're going to need renewables. We're going to need a certain amount of petroleum and natural gas. We're going to need nuclear. We need to make sure that Americans have energy for our economy. We want to do it cleanly. We have a huge challenge with climate change, and it's time that we take that challenge seriously and go after it in a way that makes a difference.
But in terms of moving that, let me just drill down a little bit more.
Okay.
You came out of Sandia Labs and you worked on wind. Are you satisfied where we're at on the renewable side of the equation?
Oh, not at all.
So what should you be doing rather than being here today and moving that along forward?
Well, I should be back on the windmills again, but we need to develop energy storage capabilities so that we can store the intermittent energy that comes out of wind and solar so that it can be transmitted when the wind and the solar goes down. I think that would be the most important thing we could do, but we need tax credits to do that. We need to continue to make renewables more appealing to the marketplace.
And Jerry, you're at the bar, you're having an old-fashioned, I'm sorry, Henry, you're at the bar, you're having an old-fashioned, you're having a drink with your fellow Congress. Where is he just not getting the picture?
No, he is getting the picture. Look, the problem that we have in Washington, D.C., that it's a zero-sum game. Either you're for fossil fuel or you're for energy, the alternative energy, and it's nothing else in the middle. I come from Texas. I represent the Eagle Ford, which is, one of the biggest producers in the state of Texas. Texas is number one in oil producing, in oil, number one in gas, number one in lignite coal, and then number one in wind production also. So we got everything there. The thing is, we got to get away from the two extremes where it's either my side or the other side, and people just don't want to sit down and see, I'm one of those that I feel that, we are going to be using fossil fuel. With all respect, some of the folks that are against fossil fuel, I don't see them riding a bicycle all day. They do still use cars.
I joined the bicycle caucus. Yeah, there's a bicycle Earl Blumenauer was here earlier.
And the thing is, yeah, he's done that very well. But the thing is, we got to make sure that we're able to understand that we can have both as we have a transition from fossil, but fossil fuel is going to be around for a while.
But before I go to Dan, I'd like to just, for precision's sake, if you're looking forward and say we're together 10 years from now, and we're not thinking about what the case is today, but what we will have wanted to achieve, we have COP21, we've got targets that everybody I know who's in the climate change business tells me that what we agreed to collectively in Paris is not enough. And so I'm just wondering how we get beyond this fuzzy for everything and actually get to a point where the thumb is put on renewables and the thumb is put down on fossil fuels. And so I recognize that they may be around for a long time, but short of a carbon tax, which we could discuss, but what are the strategies for actually getting a transition in the mix?
Well, why not include the industry a little bit more? Why just let regulators decide what they think is right? And that's what we need to do. Is I'm hoping that this new administration, the Clinton administration, will be more of a practical aspect. A little louder, guys. Clinton administration will be more practical in allowing the industry to have a say-so instead of having certain folks make that decision. Keep in mind, if you notice the new vice president, I looked up the background. He does have a little bit of experience in the fossil fuel.
Do you support the COP21 targets?
I want to get to the goal, but I still want to get the industry involved.
Do you support the COP21 targets?
Well, I think the big difference is that we need to move expeditiously to reducing carbon fuels. So I think that's the key difference.
So you're on board. I asked Bill Johnson that very directly, and he said Donald Trump would definitely not support the COP21 targets and would actually withdraw from the agreement. I just wanted to put that as a point of record. Dan, you were a regulator, one of those lovely, great regulators that are celebrated in this. When you thought about Connecticut, and Connecticut, as I understand, has a very big natural gas footprint, has a very big nuclear footprint. When you're responsible for a state and what its mix of alternatives are, and when you're, again, thinking 10 years ahead in terms of what you want to leave, what's the legacy of the energy course you want to set, what are you thinking about, and what did you do, and did you screw up or did you get it right?
Well, you could probably put me between these two guys because when you're the commissioner.
Okay, Henry, why don't you move? No,
No, quite seriously, when you're the commissioner of energy,
Yeah.
and I was energy and environment, you have to take very seriously the need for cheaper, cleaner, and more reliable energy across the board. And I say that especially as the guy who was commissioner during not one but 2 hurricanes that hit Connecticut.
right.
And there is nothing like having the lights out for 4 or 5 days across most of the state to remind you of why energy matters so much to everyday lives. Having said that, we are in need of a transition. And I think what Connecticut did under Governor Malloy with this spirit of cheaper, cleaner, more reliable energy to launch the first in the nation green bank to help finance the shift to more renewable energy and even more important in some ways to ramp up dramatically the commitment to energy efficiency
Right.
helped that process begin.
What do you think you got wrong during your tenure?
Nothing.
I'm not in that.
Dan is an honest guy. He's
I'm not
actually
in
an
that
academic.
Trumpian spirit
Yeah.
of never admitting a mistake.
Yeah.
I think there is a constant need to rebalance how fast and how far you can go. And I'll tell you, the thing that I regret most is not having done more to change, and this will sound terribly boring, but it turns out sometimes boring things are important, the business model of our utilities. I should have pushed our regulatory authority, our public utility regulatory authority, to shift what the utilities get paid for. They should be getting paid for ramping up efficiency, driving renewables, lowering prices of electricity, improving efficiency, improving reliability. We should get away from rate cases and have performance bonuses that determine how much utilities get paid.
You know, my friend Alex Lasky's in here somewhere, who's CEO of O-Power. I don't know if many of you know the firm, but O-Power is one of these companies that's tried to work with utilities. They go in and they essentially, it's in a way behavioral engineering, if I may, where you let your neighbor know what your energy use is, and that awareness of what your neighbor is doing actually affects someone's energy consumption.
And Steve, what we found
Yeah.
is that nothing motivates people more in terms of gearing up around the idea of more efficiency, or for that matter, putting a solar array on the roof, than to see the neighbor doing it. It doesn't matter if you hear that it's done in California.
Right.
It doesn't matter if you hear it's done in Texas. You know, they're big on wind. Nobody thinks Connecticut is California or Texas. You need to look across the street. And that makes people say, you know, maybe I could do that too.
Jerry, how's it going in California? Because I had the privilege of interviewing Jerry Brown about 5 years ago, and we had the people from Solar City, a number of other people in the panel. It was a forum at UCLA, and we were looking at his distributed energy goals and what they were going to do. I think it was 20% by 2020 or something of that sort, and beginning to look at whatever. And when you got in and began talking about solar, but other forms of distributed energy, the permitting county by county and the utility madness that was going on in California was a real barrier. Has that gotten better in your state, or are they going to hit that goal, and is it a good goal to hit?
Well, the utilities are actually on board with most of what's happening, and the state is moving forward pretty well. Some of the earlier goals were met before the timeline, and so the goals have actually had to be increased to keep the motivation high up there. So things are moving along pretty expeditiously, and people are happy with the results.
Does the low oil price that we have today, I think I paid $1.94 a gallon driving up here, does that screw renewables? Is that dynamic really undermining the economic? And is that, I mean, I just want to ask you about the economics of the transition, that when you imagine, you know, $4 a gallon gas and the sort of barrels of oil for other forms of energy use at a higher price, doesn't that provide more leeway for I guess the absorption of those technologies on a better cost-benefit basis? Henry?
Well, you know, we know it's going to be one of those that's going to go down. Prices are going to go up. But I mean,
When it's up, it never really felt like it.
Yeah, I mean, I think when the prices, let's say the gallon's at $4, it certainly will get people to think about doing something about the renewables or looking at other forms of energy. But the thing is, we ought to be constant. We ought to know what our goal is going to be and what we're going to go after to find that, you know, striking that balance on it. But unfortunately, that's human nature. I mean, if the prices are high, then we start talking a little bit more of the alternatives on that.
Well, let me take a crack
Yeah,
at this.
sure,
I
yeah.
was 20 years in the industry. And when the oil prices went down, of course, people lost their jobs.
Are you the
Companies
only
went up.
wind engineer in Congress?
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
you're the only
I spent 20 years developing the technology.
It's like Hickenlooper being the only governor.
Well, we were there at the beginning. I can tell you stories, but we were there at the beginning. We
Yeah.
had basically a clean sheet of paper and made some beautiful equipment and designed the new technology that you're seeing out there now. So
Yeah.
it's a wonderful experience. But
But about
the
on the
price
cost
of oil really
price of oil.
impacts. You have to have parts that take 18 months to order, lead time. You got a 2-3 year permitting process. You got power purchase agreements. So when you have uncertainty in terms of the price that you're going to get for your electricity, people lose their jobs.
Steve, can I
Yeah,
just add a
please,
point on
sure.
this? So one of the things I think we've come to recognize, and the congressman is right, the price goes up, the price goes down. Some things are short-term effects. People start buying bigger cars when there's cheap gas.
That's right.
But I would urge people to watch what's going on in the finance community. This turns
Right.
out to be a big signal of where the world is going and what people's expectation is about long-term payoffs. And right now, coal companies are going bankrupt, and the investments in wind and solar and the investments in R&D around storage, which is the key, as the congressman has pointed out, to
Right.
addressing this intermittency problem, are going up, staying strong. So I think you see a long-term expectation that the price of carbon is going to rise in one way or another, in one form or another. And I would argue, by the way, that the real way we're going to bridge the gap, not only between these guys, but across the aisle to get action, is to design strategies that respond to what the country needs and get beyond the yes-no to a place where you can bring Republicans on board with some kind of an approach that puts a price on carbon as part of a grand bargain out over time.
So you're saying there's essentially an informal carbon tax in place now?
I would say that, first of all, in California, there is a carbon charge in place as part of a cap and trade program. In the northeastern states where the regional greenhouse gas initiative is in place, we have a price on carbon. There is a price on carbon in many countries across the world and a price coming in critical places like China. 2017, a carbon charge going in China. So the old argument, well, we can't do it because our trade competitors don't do it, isn't true.
Do you have faith that China, India, Brazil, other developing nations are going to play well in this case? Because one of the arguments that many, I remember being with John Podesta at a forum, we had the head of the Packard Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, the Open Society Institute, all the sort of, Rockefeller Foundation, the major funders of climate-based projects. And the worry was that unless you really got China on a different track, nothing we did in the United States would actually matter. So just real quickly, do you have faith in what's happening internationally, that what we're trying to do in this country makes
So
sense?
I was a negotiator of the original 1992 climate change agreement. And I thought after 5 rounds of negotiation over 2 years, the deal signed at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, we were done. And then I said, okay, I'm finished with that. I can leave Washington, go become a professor at Yale. 20 years later, I wake up, nothing's happened. So we know that some agreements don't work and don't deliver. I think what was negotiated in Paris last December is a breakthrough, is a rise in the trajectory of global action. I think the focus on solutions, the recognition you need everybody in. The big breakthrough was that we no longer have the world separated into an Annex 1 list of countries that have signed up for action and then everybody else that has not. Everybody signed up. Now, having watched China for a long time, I think we're going to need to be very vigilant. There's a lot of wrong data, false data that comes out, but there is a 5-year review mechanism in this agreement from Paris. And I think we're going to be able to see over the next couple of years who's serious and who's not. And I believe that most countries are pretty serious, and that represents a dramatic watershed in the global response.
Let me ask you what the responsible step forward is on fracking. And I know that, Henry, you're a member of the Shale Caucus in the House. After the event that we did in Cleveland, I've received hundreds of emails about it, but some very constructive. They said, for everyone that's talking about how shale gas and fracking have been the game changer economically for new investment returning to the United States, and I think there's an argument to be made in that direction. They said that the downside costs to health, quality of water. I have family members in Oklahoma. There are all these crazy earthquakes that are beginning to build that are very disconcerting. I guess my question to you guys is, have we adequately processed what's going on with fracking, or do we just have a lot of assertions where people say, I've interviewed the entire North Dakota delegation, and not one of them will say that there's anything wrong at all and any concern with fracking. And so I'm just wondering, is it all geography, or is anybody rising above their state interests and actually asking important scientific questions and what those questions ought to be? I mean, is it just something that we're going to be guided in by politics and not by science? Dan?
Well, I'm a believer that we should, and this may seem contradictory, continue to frack and extract natural gas as a way to diminish the carbon footprint of our country by shifting our power sector out of coal. But I would do that with much tougher regulation. And I think
But regulation to achieve what? Because it
address
has
all
to have a
issues-
sense of
all
what the
issues
downside
you
consequences
said.
are.
You've got to address the question of whether there's earthquakes. You've got to address the contamination by the chemicals used to frack of the immediate water supplies. You've got to address, most importantly, the leakage question. Because if you've got methane leaking, it's a very potent greenhouse gas.
And we have examples of
in
that.
Connecticut, we committed to an expanded natural gas profile for our energy future, but with a zero leak standard. Zero leak. I believe that's doable. I believe you can reline
Is that
old
politically
pipes.
doable? Is that something that
It's
Clinton-
both economically and politically doable, and I think it's, again, part of these trade-offs, the bargain. If these two guys are both going to be accommodated, and beyond that, the Republicans
We're going to get
as
them
well,
to the bar later and find
we're going to
out.
get them to the bar, but here's how I would do it. We agree there's a trajectory of natural gas as a transition to a clean energy future out in at some point, but we do it with much tougher standards to ensure that the short-term price is not one we can't afford in terms
Henry?
of environmental impact.
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much agree with you. And the whole thing is, I mean, we certainly want to be based on science.
Right.
But as you know, politics comes in and people won't even look at the science and everything becomes very political. The thing is, can we sit down and have those trade-offs that you talked about? Because, the problem is, I mean, I can see it in Washington, D.C., not only between Democrats and Republicans, but even between Democrats and Democrats, in the sense that some of us come from energy-producing states, and we just want to be able to sit down and talk about some of those trade-offs on that.
I think the real craze, if I may, with some of what I've seen just the last few days in this election, is a concern that in the Congress you have a lot of people that deny climate change. And so at that level, how do you sit down and have that discussion?
Or against dealing with climate change?
Right.
Let me tell you, having observed this issue for 25 years, I think the opposition is not so much about science as about policy.
Yeah.
And if we had something that pulled people together, not ripped them apart, and had more of a market dimension to it that Republicans could sign on to, and perhaps had this grand bargain dimension to it, I mean, again, just to throw an idea out that these guys won't be asked to respond to because it may be politically too tough, but what about a slow rising carbon charge, starting at $5 per ton, rising $5 per ton per year for 20 years, up to $100 a ton, with the revenue entirely up to the Republicans to decide what gets done with it. Cut corporate taxes, do whatever you want. Democrats get the mechanism.
That may be the first big idea of this convention.
I
Henry,
think-
would you go for that? Would you sign on board?
Well, I still want to have the Democrats have a say so. We spend that. Yeah, I mean, I think if anything, if we do anything, again, I'm very interested in making sure that we bring not only the regulators but the industry involved also. But the thing is, if we do anything, it's got to be incremental, because there are some folks that want to come in and do everything at one thing, kind of say, this is the end of my term, so we're going to get this done.
Right.
If we can do some of that incremental.
Yeah.
So, Henry, that's why I'm with you. 20 years
Yeah.
to phase this in.
20 years. Well, I was looking.
And by the way, you would get, I think, a number of your guys on board, and the oil industry has said it wants that kind of a thing.
Well, we got a lot of lawyers in the room. They can help draft it.
So, I mean, I've
Gary?
actually proposed the legislation, H.R. 4283.
This is tweetable. HR
right.
4283.
And
What does it
it's-
tell? What does it
At
do?
hashtag.
It's a consumer rebate act which raises the price of carbon gradually, and every quarter sends a check from all the monies that's taken in to every legal resident of this country, and it's shown modeling shows that will improve the economy. So it'll help us become more efficient, and it'll reduce our carbon emissions at the same time. But the thing is, if it's in your own interest to believe something, you're going to be able to talk yourself into it. And I think a lot of our colleagues on the other side, it's in their interest to believe that climate change is a hoax, and they're believing that because it's in their personal interest. So we need to break through that somehow.
You know, I want to go to the audience here in just a bit, but I want to ask you guys, we did an experiment recently at the Atlantic, and we're not trying to be warm and fuzzy or get everybody in this kumbaya moment or anything like that, but you know, we did take a person who was a leading advocate for public school unions and public schools, and had her in a forum with one of the leading critics of this person, who was a big advocate for charter schools and charter school overalls. And I asked them, in the spirit of sort of civitas, could you take each other's views and argue the merits of the other side? And so they did it. They did a brilliant job coming together, and they actually changed places. And one pretended to be Randy Weingarten, and the other pretended to be, she pretended to be Chip, I forget, Finn, Chip Finn. And in that process, we learned something, which is that even if you do have major rivalries, major differences, the best players in this are understanding or getting a sense of what the merits are. And I'm interested, if you were to critique the environmental movement, and if you were going to critique the fossil fuel sector, what do you think each is most missing in the way they're thinking of it? So I just want you to be reflective and critical, or I'll give you a chance. You can sort of praise the fossil fuels. You know, what are they getting right, and what do you think the environmental community is getting right?
Well, I mean, the fossil fuel, if you look at history, there's rises and falls in prices. There's nations win wars and lose wars. It's an incredibly important part of our economy and our civilization. So
But doesn't that sound
we
like...
need to use
yeah,
it properly.
yeah, right.
But what the environmentalists, in my opinion, are often a little too ideological. They're not willing to look at how we can work together to get
We're about to hear from some
solutions.
yeah.
So, I mean, that's my big critique.
Henry?
Exactly the same thing. I think the environmentalists, with all due respect, they either take it, you're with us, against us. If you're not with us 100%, then it's too much on the ideology. And same thing with the energy folks also. It's if you're not with them, and this is, you know, if you're not with us 100%, then the same thing. I think both sides have taken the position, either you're with us 100% of the time, and I'll call it votes. If you're not with us 100% of the votes, then you're on the other side. The energy folks do that, and certainly the
But can you understand,
environmentalists
you know, when
do that.
Donald Trump goes to California and says there is no California drought, I mean, that can be, I mean, you've been working on this, that can be a fairly frustrating moment. And I think, you know, again, one of the questions I have, and then we will go to questions from the audience, is this an issue that can be solved reasonably over time, or is it one where, like in the gun issue with members on the floor of the House, keeping the Democrats keeping the floor open and going and streaming live online. We had a program today earlier on Alzheimer's, and Earl Blumenauer was very passionate about how we were faking some of what we were doing by way of appropriations in mental health, and that was rising to an issue that needed to be. Is this that kind of issue, or is it one that has to be solved in a kumbaya style at some level at the bar?
Well, I mean, we have to work across the aisle to get major things done in Washington. The exception was the Affordable Care Act, and that was a political problem for us and continues to be. We need to work together, and so we need to find a way to communicate and to bridge that gap.
Henry, Dan?
Yeah, same thing. I mean, you can take this issue, you can take immigration reform, you can take border security. If people don't do it together, you're going to just have two extreme positions where people are not going to listen to each other.
So after 3 years being a commissioner in Connecticut, I concluded there's two kinds of people in the
Did
world.
you say take this job and shove it when you were done? Or?
You know, it was a great joy, but you suffer a lot from the extremes banging on you every day. And I concluded that there are two views of the world. There's the view of the world that wants to be a hero. And if you want to be a hero as an elected official or as an executive appointee, and you want to do what one side or the other wants every day, you can be a hero. You'll get prizes. They'll, you know, invite you to be the environmentalist of the year. But if you want to get something done, you got to give up being the hero and come to the middle, as the congressmen both have said, and be willing to bang it together and go home without all that you wanted in a compromise. And I think there's a possibility of doing that in laying a trajectory to a clean energy future in the coming administration, but it will take willingness to compromise.
And it's not only being a hero also, but be ready to be called a traitor, a sellout, et cetera, if you decide to get to the middle to work out a compromise, because you're not pure on one side or the other.
Fascinating. Let me open up the floor. We have microphones around. Where's Ben? Ben Adler's in the front. I promised him the first. If you don't take it, I'm not coming back to you. But microphone right here.
Excuse me, sir.
Microphone. Where's the microphone?
Okay, come on.
Okay.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you all for
He
being here.
said he would only come to this event if he could ask the first question. It's all yours. Ben Adler of Grist.
Oh, I'm
Yes.
sorry. Ben Adler.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
a reporter for Grist. It's an environmental news site. And we're very self-important, so I had to ask first.
I've been reading it for years.
I have a question for everyone who agrees with the statement, which some folks have made today, that fossil fuels are going to have to be a major part of our energy portfolio in the future. It seems to me that the studies that would be based on all start from the premise that the government isn't aggressively intervening to change that. And I understand, obviously, with Republican control of the House, there are political reasons you could say, well, we're not going to realistically change that. But I'm curious if anyone would defend, and why and how, the assertion that we shouldn't do everything we can to change that, to tax carbon emissions, use the money to expand renewables more rapidly than they otherwise would.
Right, and can I piggyback on this great question, which is, in every projection I've seen, the share of renewables, and a lot of people talk about just the dynamics of scaling, that scaling these technologies, investing in the technologies as you model them out, even if you had very robust circumstances, that they can't get a much larger, a dramatically larger footprint so that you still have a majority of fossil fuels in the sector. So if I could just tag that on. But Henry, do you want to respond to Ben?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're right in the sense that, I'll start off with talking about premises. Let's assume that tomorrow morning there's no more petroleum, there's no more gas, natural gas. Then what happens to our economy? What happens to our day-to-day life? Just imagine, all of a sudden there was nothing available. Are we ready to make that transition from one day to the other? There are some folks that want to make that transition from one day to the other. Now, as to what that transition would be and what we do to incentivize so we can move on to alternatives, I don't know. And I think that's part of the trade-offs that we need to look at. But the thing is, I'll go back to the same thing, the extremes. Some people feel that we're going to have fossil fuel and that's the only type of fuel, and I think that's wrong. We are going to have a transition. We are going to have fossil fuels. Question is, how long, what do we have to give in during that transition as we go to other fuels?
Jerry?
Well, I mean, I think what I'd like to see is increasing the tax on carbon emissions and eliminating over a fairly brief period of time all the subsidies that are out there for all the energy sources and make them play on an even field. I think that would be a huge step in getting to where we need to go. And it'll build up renewables and make us much more efficient.
Dan?
So I think we certainly need to shift the economic incentives as quickly as possible, but I think we do have to drive innovation as the centerpiece of our strategy for getting to a clean energy future. And I would start with the innovation around storage. We cannot base load wind and solar power until we've solved their intermittency problem. This is a big, big deal. So to Henry's point, we're not able to do this tomorrow. We don't have cost-effective storage. And I would argue, by the way, the incentives that we need and the investment in innovation that we need is not just technology development. It's innovation in policy. It's innovation in public engagement to get people committed to this clean energy future. It's innovation, even most importantly, in finance. It turns out that the big question nobody asked in the 20th century about the environment was who's going to pay for all the things we need to do. By the way, not only in moving towards a clean energy future, in investing in safe drinking water. And that has failed across this country in a number of places. So thinking hard, this is a big 21st century question. So Steve, you can put it on your list of big ideas. The 21st century question is, where's the money coming from for the good things we want to do? And how do you get incentives, frankly, to ensure that we use limited public resources to leverage private capital? because that's where most of the money is always going to be.
I'll mention for you this. I don't like to make Dan Esty ever feel too good about himself, but he, when he was in Connecticut, helped develop the first in the nation green bank. He also wrote a book that's been very helpful to me called Green to Gold: How Smart Companies Use Environmental Strategy to Innovate, Create Value, and Build Competitive Advantage. So that's another way to go. Yes, right here in the middle. There are bunches of questions. So, okay, I guess we'll get to you next. Yes, go right ahead.
Is this working? Is this one working? Hi, Patrick Whitty. I work for a company called Invenergy, and we are the largest privately held wind, solar, and battery storage company. But about 40% of our assets are also natural gas, so we understand the idea of a balanced transition to a clean energy future. My question goes to the idea of energy not being a zero-sum game, because when you look at the electric grid in particular, energy is in fact a zero-sum game in many ways when we have flat demand or even declining demand. And so the question is, are there policy ideas or strategies that any of you would endorse that would be aimed at growing demand in the electric sector, perhaps from moving away from petroleum in the transportation sector, so that we can continue to achieve scale and cost reductions in wind, solar, and other technologies like storage?
Quick thoughts.
So in Connecticut, we, for example, invested in building out a network of electric vehicle charging stations all across the state to ensure there was no range anxiety as part of a transition to make people feel comfortable about electric vehicles, which is a key way to bring down the emissions from the transportation sector. And I think big thinking like that's critical. If I had a magic wand, I would wave it across New England and have an integrated energy marketplace with Eastern Canada and tap the hydropower potential that is available across Eastern Canada. Clean energy, low impact, and has the potential to allow a greater electrification of society with reduced carbon
But
impact.
let me just drill down here for a minute, because you asked about displacing petroleum. When I am actually interested in the subject. When you look at and you get the economic modelers to look at the kind of infrastructure issue, I haven't seen a study anywhere, and maybe someone in the room can disabuse me of this, that shows that kind of large-scale transition of that infrastructure could happen within 30 or 40 years, like that the scale, and I don't know why it has to be so slow, but I'm just wondering, am I wrong? But digging down with serious people, we had a person at Ford Motor Company who was very, very interested in the transition. She's now working in the Department of Commerce, major advocate for that transition, but says it's still going to be 4 or 5 decades, that the continued mix of fuel and energy options. Is that?
I think you're right, but
Yeah.
by the way, a 20 or 30 years is better than a 40 or 50-year transition.
Right.
So actually, these incremental shifts are important as a matter of policy.
Jerry?
Well, I think the transportation sector is absolutely key, and we've heard about that. But energy efficiency is incredibly important. If we can make our buildings more efficient, if we can make our lighting more efficient, which we're heading in that direction. So we need the proper incentives to build buildings and to retrofit buildings for efficiency and efficient use of energy and water, because water, especially
I'm really
in California,
irritated you weren't with us in Cleveland, because we had a guy from the National Building Industry Council, and the lead certification thing is that none of you Republicans have talked about efficiency in buildings, so you would have made his day. Henry?
Yeah, same thing. I mean, I think Jerry's right about the energy efficiencies for not only vehicles, which
Right.
we're getting there, but also for the buildings, but also being innovative, like you said. You mentioned Canada. I'll mention. I represent the border area. Instead of putting a wall, what we rather see is a low water weirs where you can use the hydro energy, where Mexico gets some of that electricity, we get some, just like in Canada. I mean, we just got to think outside the box. The problem is we don't think outside the box. Everything is here or here, and if you dare get over here in the middle, you're going to get criticized by one side or the other that you're.
Is that part of the political lingo now? Instead of the wall, we can have this?
Yeah.
That's interesting. You're the first
Well,
person used to it. The wall has become such a thing you can
I'm glad
negotiate
the
for something
Clinton
better.
campaign is using something that we've been using. Instead
Yeah.
of wall, we'd rather have bridges. And low water weirs to make sure we can get energy for both the Mexican side or outside
Be a
also.
good article. What I'm going to do real quick is take a couple of lightning round questions and comments. So right here, we're going to just quick question, and we'll have quick responses in group.
Hi, Joan Michelson, Green Connections and Huffington
Yeah.
Post. Good job, Steve.
Thanks.
As usual. Two issues that we really haven't talked about are we're running into a huge workforce issue. When you talk about innovation, we need real diversity. With all due respect, you guys are great, but you're 4 white guys, right?
Totally
I'm
agree.
Latino, but still. So
Let me tell you, if that
they
Bill
know that
Clinton
I'm-
event wouldn't have been going on right now, I'm a beef with Bill Clinton right now. There'd be a very different crowd up here. Sorry, guys. I just want to put.
Well, the audience
Yeah.
is very heavy
Yeah.
female too.
Yeah.
So the other issue is the grid. I mean, you talk about infrastructure.
Right.
I mean, that is the ultimate part of the infrastructure, right? Is the grid. There are
Yeah.
microgrids. There are microgrid companies that are actually
Right.
paying customers to use them. What is your take on the microgrids, and what is your take on having the workforce
Got it.
actually
Great
do-
question right here. You got to do it in the mic. We got millions watching here, more than you know.
Doug Blasey,
Okay.
a colleague of yours from the EPA years ago.
Yeah,
I'm
good.
interested in nuclear power, redundancy, and environmental justice or equity. For how do we
Nuke
afford
power,
this?
environmental
Whether it be
justice.
building efficiency, if you're
Nuclear.
poor and live in a house that needs windows and insulation, how do you afford
God,
it?
you pack in a lot fast. Okay, right here, this gentleman here with a little orange stringer on his neck. Are you two related? No. Okay, good.
Okay. Hi, I'm Brad Johnson with Climate Hawks Vote. This has been a fascinating discussion, and
Want to have a drink at the bar after? There we go.
I might need one. I'm basically interested in the one thing that's been really impressive in the Democratic Party this year has been the move to recognize that the fossil fuel industry has been deliberately poisoning our political discourse for the last several decades. And one of the major institutions of that is the American Petroleum Institute, which is the funder of this event. And I'm wondering, I'd be certainly interested in learning on a personal level why you're comfortable with engaging in this process of propaganda.
Do you
But
think
I'd
this is
also-
propaganda?
I mean, I don't know if you've read the fortune cookies, but what's presented in these fortune cookies is quite simply, I'd hope not controversial in this audience, that it's flatly incompatible with the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement that this audience supports, and certainly incompatible with the scientific necessity to
Got it.
preserve civilization. I'm just wondering,
Yeah.
because I have a child,
Yeah.
I have a young child, I'd be interested to know why you're comfortable with engaging in this process of threatening his future.
Thank you. Do you want to raise something too, real quick?
Erica McKenzie, Temple University. Less politically charged. I was wondering if you could comment on the low-hanging fruit and what we can do to pluck those low-hanging fruit.
Great. And let's take this one last question right here in the middle. I'm sorry, guys, we're just going to.
Hi, my name is Laura Kofsky.
forgot
I'm a
all the
young professional, and I'm also on the steering committee for 350 Philadelphia. And my question has to do with wind tax credits, the PTC and ITC. Those credits are actually due to continually drop through 2019. And my question is, what's the reason for that? And also, is there anything being done to compensate for those credit drops on wind energy?
Do any of you follow the wind energy issue? Jerry, this is your bread and butter.
Well, it's,
I mean, you can answer all of it, but I want you to start
well,
with
it's
the
pretty
wind energy.
political. Joe Biden did a huge effort to get the PTC extended for wind energy a couple of years ago. That's already expiring. It's a political challenge, and that's something that we need. We have strong disagreement on, and we need to move forward. But again, a slowly rising carbon tax and eliminate all the extra tax credits would be a much better solution.
Any other thoughts on that, on the wind? So how about the child, the future child, and this broad notion that we've got players, and API has been mentioned, but there are others. I talked to Sheldon Whitehouse earlier, who's also at the Bill Clinton meeting. I invited him to drop by. But there are people that say, hey, we're having a kind of a lobbying sleight of hand that is somehow distorting and corrupting the quality of conversation. My stakes, as I want to pay respect to the gentleman who asked the question, is I'm the kind of person that believes you can have a responsible conversation with anyone. I would meet, but I tend to sort of be that kind of person. But where do you, Dan, you all have kind of referred to this, but how do you have the kind of responsible conversation that looks at the future without necessarily, how do you honor what this gentleman was saying in terms of that when you have someone drawing a line in the sand about who you can talk to on both sides? The both sides see each other as nefarious players.
So I think that's the problem right there. if you have a conversation that's utterly polarized, and that's been one of the themes of the conversation and you've led here, Steve, this afternoon, I don't think you can get anywhere. And you heard me say, I negotiated the Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992. I thought the job was done. And I think what we understood in retrospect was that was what I call the lawyer's mistake. Thinking that if you passed a law, signed a treaty, got regulations promulgated, you're done. And it turns out nothing happened for 20 years. So then I had to step back and ask why. And the answer was because we had a deep political divide that had to be bridged. And you heard several people say it. Let me reiterate it today or later today. And that is, you cannot do a big thing in our society with a one-party answer to the problem. You've got to find a middle ground to bring people together. And we heard Obamacare. Obamacare is under stress because we can't get people together to fix it as we know it could be fixed. So in Connecticut, one of the things I did was get Democrats and Republicans in the room, sign energy legislation, put together energy legislation that passed unanimously in the state Senate with only 5 votes against in the House of Representatives that created an integrated Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, launched the Green Bank, created ramped up funding for efficiency as the most effective thing you can do, pushed up by tenfold the commitment to renewable power, and at the same time said we're going to have a transition that includes natural gas.
Right.
I stand by that. I think that's a package that got people together. I think that's a thoughtful package. And I did it after 20 years of watching my little children growing up in a world that was doing nothing about climate change. And I feel that package is more responsible than a polarized debate that continues to produce nothing.
Great. Thoughts, Henry, Jerry, real quickly?
Yeah, let me, first of all, notice what we all have been saying is that there's just, the extreme sides have taken over, not only for this debate, on guns, on abortion, just name it, everything is so polarized. Healthcare, I voted for healthcare. But I'm one of those members that I feel that just like any major piece of legislation, you come back, you look at what works, you keep it, the things that don't work, you modify, you repeal it. And right now, the Republicans take a position that you got to repeal the whole thing. Then you have Democrats on the other side that don't want to change one single word because we act like it's a perfect piece of legislation, which it's not. It's a good piece of legislation, but 2 extremes that don't want to sit down and make it work. First of all, I want to say API, I want to thank them for sponsoring this. And if the green folks, environmentalists want to sponsor this, we all would have been here also. And instead of trying to demonize each other, let's sit down and how we can make this work because we're all acting like members of Congress. It's so polarized where people don't want to talk to each other. And we just got to make sure that we're able to sit down and not demonize each other.
Can I just do a 10-second intervention in support of Henry's comment, which is, when I pulled these Republicans and Democrats together to create this big energy package in Connecticut, it went through, as I said, near unanimously and then unanimously on one side. 2 years later, it turns out I'd made a lot of mistakes, maybe 20 serious mistakes that had to be fixed.
When I asked you if you made mistakes, I had no idea you were going to make them.
But here's the point. Anytime you do something big and transformative, you're going to make mistakes,
right?
And you should be honest about it. The little follow-on to Henry's story is I brought all those Republicans and Democrats back together and I said, I've made some mistakes. I want you to help me fix them. And because people on both sides were bought in, they said, yes, of course we'll fix them because we're pleased about what you're getting done. And the Republicans said, we are so thrilled that you're using private capital to drive the energy agenda. And the Democrats said, we're so pleased you're bringing down the greenhouse gas emissions. So people came together and we fixed almost all the mistakes. Now, this 2 years on fixed bill did not pass unanimously in either House or Senate. So there was starting to be some edges of dissent, but overwhelmingly. So I think you can do it if you engage in goodwill and try to find that tough middle ground.
Let's just do really quick. We had grids. My friend on diversity, I couldn't agree with you more, and we'll talk about that over a mojito
Yo voy a
or
hablar
something.
español.
I got a lot of
There's
drinks.
little
No, the
diversity.
issue is, honestly, I want to pay respect to my friends at The Intercept. This was a members forum. We were just going to have members of Congress, and there we, would do this. Dan got on in part because I knew him. I could call him. I called him like 3 hours ago and said, "Hey, we need help. But we should have called you, and I apologize. So, but in the process of this, but if we could talk about essentially grids, microgrids, nuclear power, and essentially environmental generational justice, if I understand that right. So any quick thoughts, and we'll close this
Quick
up.
thoughts. Innovation on the workforce, trying to get community colleges, trying to get some of the universities to focus on what the future needs are going to be is going to be very important. I agree with you on the workforce itself. We just got to make sure we get some of the other institutions like higher ed involved a lot more.
Well, in terms of workforce diversity, the majority of people that work in these fields are older white folks, and we have a challenge to get anybody that wants to get into it. It takes engineering, it takes science. These are hard fields. We need to encourage people to get into that. It doesn't matter what your background is. In terms of nuclear power, the challenge with nuclear power is, one, the cost, and two, the nuclear waste, and also fail-safe technology. We have some challenges with nuclear, but we have good engineers out there that can solve these things.
And if I can just add on diversity, and you're absolutely right. Everybody has a different district. My district is about 80% Hispanic. In fact, I just spoke at another place on energy and Hispanics. A lot of the folks working in the energy.
Was that sponsored by API?
No, actually sponsored by the Hill Latino. And while we were there, what we were there is, if you look at the diversity there, it's mainly Hispanic, so it's actually the other way. So you got large number of Latinos or Hispanics que hablan español y están trabajando duro to make sure that they work on that particular sector itself and on the wind sector also.
Dan?
So in terms of diversity, I teach in a school that 65% of the students are women. And so this is a field, energy, environment, sustainability, which is, I think, the 21st century name that we're all going to be calling it, is very much on the agenda of women in particular, but also Black and Hispanic and other minorities that haven't thought this to be their issue in the past. But I think we've now seen, whether it's Flint, Michigan, or challenges in energy and the burning of fossil fuels in urban areas and creating of asthma and other respiratory issues, a lot of reasons why this is a much broader agenda. And I do think, by the way, one of the reasons to be excited about a distributed generation, small-scale renewable power, efficiency investments is that a lot of the work to do that up on the rooftop is blue-collar jobs that can't be exported. And those are great opportunities to lift the economics along, not just for the engineers, who are going to have part of the R&D money, but for a much broader set of folks in our society. So I'm excited about a build agenda, because we are not going to simply wave a wand and create the clean energy agenda and the clean energy future. It's going to be a build agenda with opportunities across the whole economic spectrum.
Let me just say, partial to my friend here with the son who raised it, because I thought it was very passionately, very well put, so I want to thank you for that. But in my own journey, and thank you all for being in this, in raising a lot of these uncomfortable conversations, and they are uncomfortable in a sense because you have people that are very polarized, sitting at the same bar in the same room. We often bring people together to do this. That when you think about what is required to get people into that civitas moment, to sort of think about the other side of it, the young child and what kind of life they're going to be living. I tell you, my parents come from Bartlesville, Oklahoma, which is an oil town, and it was, many of you may be from Bartlesville, but it's, not a great place for a lot of people that are in that town and that city, and they've have had limited options, failed investment in other kinds of things, and so I do think it's important to bring together people. I want to share one vignette of something I felt was very Atlantic-y in what we try to achieve, but I think it would have never have made anyone happy with what we did. We had an event. It happened to be at an ambassador's residence, and I got him to provide the food, and I invited all the guests. And among them, we had Jack Gerard, who was president of the American Petroleum Institute. I also had the head of the Climate Reality Project, Al Gore's thing. I had Sheldon Whitehouse and Ed Markey, but I also had John Barrasso and Joe Manchin, who, for that purposes of that night, was on the Republican side. And don't tell Joe I said that. And we had Ernie Moniz, and we had an interview with Ernie Moniz. So we had in the room those that had significant stakes in the national conversation, who came from the different corners. And I have to say that people had not really talked about issues the way they had, and they hadn't actually gotten out of their box and listened. Again, I'm not promoting some kumbaya area. I want to give credit, but there is a broader conversation, and even with someone as passionate as you, to achieve that world for your son, you got to bring allies over. You got to be able to talk about it. It's got to be part of it. So we try very hard to have that kind of conversation, consequential conversations, sometimes uncomfortable. We do our best, and with that, I will invite everybody to have a drink. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dan Esty, Henry Cuellar, Jerry McNerney. Thank you all very much. I will mention that tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., Ron Brownstein will be here bright and early for our morning briefing on the Battle of Congress. Hope you can join us, but right now, we all need a drink. Thank you very much.
Drinks on the house?
Yes, drinks on the house.
All right.